Hello, how's everyone doing? My name is Dan Waltermeyer. I am a Sales and Business Development Manager at Comodule. We are a vertically integrated connectivity provider for the micromobility industries. So some of you may have heard of us, others maybe you haven't. Give a brief intro, and then I'm here to talk to you today about exactly what e-bike riders want and some of the findings that we have within Comodule as a connectivity provider about what is driving consumer decisions in the micromobility industry. So a little background as to who we are at Comodule. We are a fully vertically integrated connectivity provider. So we do everything from producing the hardware all the way through the connectivity as a service, and then in some situations a user interface for all of the data. In other situations we kind of turn that data over to somebody else's user interface and they control the user experience from there. We really started on the fleet operator side, enabling people like Lime and Jump to connect scooter sharing services across the globe. And from there, we really transitioned into the OEM market. So now a big portion of our business is helping connect e-bikes, both on the performance side and on the commuter side, for some of the largest e-bike manufacturers in the world. We consider ourselves a global leader in connectivity. So we're currently operating in over 45 countries. We have over 600,000 vehicles that are currently connected with Comodule hardware. And we have, between all of our 53 customers and counting, we have covered more than 70 million kilometers to date. Obviously, all of those numbers are still increasing. And a little bit about exactly why we do what we do and where we think things should be. So our vision is a world where emissionless transport is people's first choice when it comes to urban commuting. The vast majority of all trips that are taken with cars nowadays are still very small point-to-point locations within an urban city center. And we believe that by improving the user experience, we can get more people to utilize micromobility to get from point A to point B. And our part in this is to use connectivity to improve the user experience in a few different ways. The primary focus today for the presentation is to kind of review a study that we did with the Spiegel Institute here in Germany. And what we wanted to do was profile a typical e-bike rider in Germany and learn via interviews and then also quantitative data questions exactly what their typical user experience was like, and try and learn a little bit more about what drives their decision making when it comes to buying a bike, riding a bike, and securing a bike. And then at the end of the whole thing, we really wanted to figure out how us as Comodule could tailor some of our future products and our current product offerings to solve as many of their problems as possible, and again, improve the user experience. Why we picked Germany? Germany is one of the largest, if not the largest e-bike market in Europe, and one of the largest in the world. But another interesting thing about Germany, which we'll talk about in just a sec, is Germany's prevalence towards using e-bikes as a car replacement rather than just as a leisure device. So a little bit about what we found out. Number one, e-bikes are replacing car trips amongst a lot of the people that we surveyed. So half of the people, the 400 people that we surveyed for this, are riding their bikes more than 50 kilometers a week. Now, if you're riding that much, it could typically put you into one of two categories. One would be somebody who's using it as a vehicle replacement, going to the store, going to drop their kids off, going to work and back. Or it could be somebody who is really into the sport category and they're riding a lot longer distances and doing it for a fitness reason. However, a few other things that we uncovered were that 70 or close to 70% of the people in the survey were using very known routes for cycling. And this kind of proved to us that the vast majority of our survey respondents were people that were using a bike as a car replacement. They were going, again, to their kids' school over and over and over again. Amongst the people surveyed, every third person actually owned more than two e-bikes, which is more than one e-bike, which was quite surprising. There are a lot of two e-bike and more households. And 34% of the people studied actually shared their bikes with other family members. And that has some interesting implications when it comes to connecting a bike, unlocking a bike, locking a bike, which we can talk about a bit later. And then lastly, the typical e-bike rider, as we determined in Germany, was 40 plus years old and they were male. There are a couple reasons we are assuming that that gender disparity is coming from. I think one of the biggest was a survey that came out a few years back that stated that safety and the lack of a feeling of safety was really keeping the female demographic from adopting e-bikes at the same rate that the male demographic was. And so that's something that we will definitely try to address when it comes to, getting more people on bikes. So first thing we did was take a look at the entire ride. So we wanted to know qualitatively, exactly what a rider was doing before the ride, during the ride, and after the ride for a typical e-bike experience. First things first, before the ride, most of the people surveyed were mainly storing their bikes at home. They were using additional locks even in their own house, getting rid of those locks, typically checking the weather, but only checking the weather to figure out what they should wear. Very important thing to point out here, and this was quite a surprise to us. Inclement weather was not discouraging most of the people that used bikes as a car replacement, with the exception of extreme cold, extreme rain. People were still going to and from their place of work, and the only reason they checked the weather was to determine which clothes to wear. And another really important thing, might sound a bit obvious, but everyone was charging their battery at home. So there were far less people that were charging their batteries for their e-bikes at their places of work, or like at the grocery store. And that's something that's really important to note. The typical profile is somebody comes home, charges the bike, and then that charge will last them quite a while, typically through their entire day. During the ride, their route was consistent most of the time, going to the store, going to schools. And a very interesting thing is that they all prioritized personalized driving experiences and preferred those. So very similar to how your car may have had an eco mode or a sport mode in the past, e-bike riders, specifically the ones we spoke to, were very interested in tailoring things like the assist levels to their riding style. Some people aren't in as much of a hurry and they'd rather get the extra range. Some people are always in a hurry and they will keep the bike in boost mode at the expense of 50% of the range or whatever it was. But the ability to personalize was a common thing across most of our survey participants. Another interesting thing was there was no overwhelming fear of accidents, and I think that's probably pretty obvious given that these people were riding more than 50 kilometers a week. But caution is still common in riding, and the thought of an accident is still on people's mind. So that kind of sums up during the ride. Now after the ride, one thing we noticed was that the bike was typically locked with one or several locks. So that was kind of a shock, which we can talk about a little bit later. But people preferred often to leave their bike in a space that they could still see, or a private parking space. So there's still that overwhelming prevailing fear of maybe somebody could cut my lock and then what happens. And to top that off, the battery was typically removed. Now, some of those batteries may have been removed for weather reasons, not to leave an older e-bike battery out in the rain when you don't necessarily trust the weatherproofing. But the overwhelming majority of people were doing it because they were afraid of battery theft. So another thing that's really important kind of for the after the ride characteristics. So I guess the first thing we asked specific questions about though was vehicle security. Riders are still taking extreme precautions to avoid theft. One thing we learned was that every third rider locks their bikes with several locks. That is really impressive because lugging a lock around on a vehicle as small as a bike is already a major task. So to lug multiple is a redundancy that probably needs to be dealt with. One kind of shocking statistic was that only 4% of people had ever actually experienced an e-bike theft. and in most cases the bike was never retrieved. Now that 4% may seem like a very low number, but when you compare that to the rate of theft of like a car in the automotive industry in Germany, that 4% is orders of magnitude higher. I think it was something like 50 out of 100,000 cars were stolen in Germany last year. So the likelihood that your bike will get stolen is still considerably higher than the likelihood your car will get stolen. 73% of those that we surveyed also had their bike insured. So insurance is usually bought together with the bike. Only 14% of the people surveyed bought it after their bike purchase. But it's important to note that insurance is still a major ask for a lot of consumers here in Germany. And another thing, I guess, that we dove into was connectivity and whether that could solve the problem of bike security. So we asked our respondents 4 different questions about 4 different categories of different features that connectivity could provide. The first was GPS tracking, the second was keyless go, the third was theft notification, and then the last was a retrieval service. And we asked them both, would that improve their feeling of security? And also if they would be interested in buying a bike that had that feature. No surprise, over 60% of the participants all said for every single category that those features would improve their feeling of security. Now, the fact that all of those could be enabled by connectivity is certainly a bonus for us, but it's something that told us we need to go ahead and enable as many of these features as possible. Another major part of our survey was asking about keyless go as an extra layer of security. So the keyless go function was actually very attractive to a lot of our riders. Almost 2/3 of the riders we talked to said that they would be interested in it and that it would increase their feeling of security. So that talks a bit about rider safety, or security, sorry. Now I guess let's talk about rider safety a bit more. So personal safety to most people is just as important as vehicle security. One of the things that we asked a lot of respondents about was whether or not they wanted an emergency call feature. So they crashed their bike, the bike automatically dials a loved one or somebody who was pre-programmed into their contacts as an emergency contact. One surprising thing about this, though, was that in regular road traffic, many people thought there were enough people around to help in case of an accident. And the primary fear was actually from those who live in more remote areas or those who are actually riding in more remote areas. That, maybe they have an accident and they can't get a hold of anybody, nobody can find them. Those were the people that really liked the emergency call feature. Now, emergency calls are another thing that we talk about when it comes to connectivity and the future of connectivity, because we are already connecting many of these vehicles to a cellular network. So the ability to make an emergency call is inherently already part of the technology. It's just a matter of enabling it. And this was a good reason for us to continue in that process to try and enable maybe an emergency call function on some of our bikes. And outside of safety, the last big one was technical assistance. And this is a huge topic because in the past, a lot of OEMs did not have a proper channel outside of a dealer to assist their users with technical help. Amongst the people in this survey, 1/3 of the riders that we talked to had technical issues with their e-bikes already, and the most common obviously was a flat tire. Most people actually were turning to a workshop, so 2/3 of people were still going back to a dealer to get service done, and about 1/3 of them were trying to solve the problems themselves. But an interesting thing that we were trying to figure out is exactly what the issues technically were and whether or not a connected bike could solve any of those, and whether or not open communication via maybe an application between an OEM and an end user could remove a lot of the fears when it came to technical issues. Main concerns with the bike overall, outside of flat tires, were battery lifespan that was unclear, the possibility of theft again, and then the heaviness of a bike. So obviously e-bikes have added a bunch of weight to the equation when it comes to bikes, and dealing with that is a bit of a challenge. A really important thing that doesn't have as much of a play when it comes to connectivity, but is still worth pointing out, is the fact that range anxiety, once a bike was purchased, is actually quite low. So people tend to take range anxiety into account when they're purchasing a bike, but once they've established their typical commuting patterns and their commuting routes, 70% of the people we spoke with had never run out of a battery, and only 14% of people were worried about it. We can imagine that there's another percentage there that have run out of a battery and they've just been able to pedal the rest of the way. But that's something really important to focus on, and one of the beliefs we have at Comodule is that as long as someone has data on their battery before they leave the house or before they even go to pick up their bike, they know whether they will make it to their end destination and back. So the important part is actually just to give them that information at the beginning when they're planning their ride. We talked about, with a lot of these survey participants, about a smartphone as a universal interface. So half of the riders are using apps currently in conjunction with their e-bike. There are still a lot of e-bikes that don't have an application that works in tandem with it. But most of the time, these people were using them for navigation, route planning, health and fitness tracking, and then weather apps. 73% of people did say, though, that a smartphone as a display is an attractive option. So yeah, that's kind of the overview of our survey and some of the things that we learned. E-bike riders, we know, want security and safety first and foremost. They want help with technical issues and they want dealer communication. And then it comes down to convenience. Any feature that we can add that might be more convenient is something they're going to be interested in. One of the things I want to talk about is exactly how connectivity can really improve all of those. So the obvious is going to be security. A connected bike is something you can track no matter where you are, especially when that tracker is embedded in the frame. You can figure out exactly where that bike is whenever it gets stolen. But another really important one is safety. You're basically bringing a bike online and keeping it in contact with a variety of different people whenever you are connecting that bike. So what that does enable are things like emergency calls, crash detection. There are sensors in a connected device that can detect a crash and then trigger a series of events in case of an emergency. But you need a few things to do that correctly. The first thing you need, obviously, is a piece of hardware in the bike. A connected piece of hardware is typically going to have an accelerometer. It's going to have cellular connection, Cat-M1, 2G, NB-IoT. That device has to be communicating with the rest of the systems on the bike if you want things like speed, if you want to personalize the riding experience. And then you have to do something with all of that data. So in the case of Comodule, we send it all up into the cloud, and then we divide it among a couple different things. One would be a data platform that does a good job profiling user data and the average user for your bike, and helps make conscious decisions about how to change the user experience to fit the riders better. And then the other goes to the companion app. The companion app, as we just spoke about, is something that most riders are using in order to personalize their ride and get more data and to keep their bikes secure. One of the things that we like to point out from Comodule is trying to do this as easily as possible. So the most recent product we have is what we would call Guardian. So Guardian is basically a plug-and-play entry-level IoT solution. It focuses on security more than anything, but also gives you a connection to your user via the companion app and a connection for the user to access different things about their bike via the companion app. There's a variety of different products that we have that can do this, but the important thing here is less about the products and it's more about the fact that connectivity is really crucial to making the user experience on an e-bike better and getting more people on bikes. Thank you all, and if you want to enable the e-bikes of tomorrow, please don't hesitate to reach out or send me an email. It's dan@comodule.com is my email.